Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm finally going to start my series on editing and how to apply the norms of editing, the rules of editing to not just stories and not just comics, but I would say the industry itself, because I think you can take these rules and apply them to the industry itself and see why it's not doing well. And there's a number of reasons why I want to do this. Number one, so that I can hopefully, both for myself and for you, clarify the rules under which I am going to criticize things from now on. And secondly, because, well, to understand these norms of editing is to understand why a story doesn't work. And I'm sure you, like me, have read a number of stories where you said to yourself, I don't like it after you're finished. And you say, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I don't like it. Well, if you know these norms of editing, well, you can more readily put your finger on why it doesn't work. And so you can understand why you want to complain, and that will give us a better tool to demand a better story. So I want to start off by talking about diversity, because I think that's what's gumming up the works in most of, I would say, the comic industry. But we're going to focus on Marvel because that's where everything gets gummed up the most. Now, my experience is with writing books and dealing with my editor and the books that I'm trying to get published. But I think writing a book and the structure of a book is very similar to comics in that you have an overarching story and you have chapters. And I think for a comic, you have an overarching story, and each of your chapters is one comic. And the thing is that where you need diversity is diversity of thought, okay? When you have diversity, because I did a video last week about diversity as weakness, and I talked about it in the comic industry, and I put diversity in quotation marks because the diversity which they think they have right now isn't diversity at all. It's fake diversity, because real diversity comes from diversity of thought. And your editor will always push you to be diverse in your thinking. It is something that is going to draw in your audience. And there are three ways that just come to mind about trying to draw in your audience through diversity, because you do need diversity when you're a writer. You need diversity which is generated from diversity of thought. And the first one that comes to mind is the fact that, well, when you have an overarching story, you need to have a denouement. You need to have a story with good characters and a good story that leads up to a denouement or a crescendo at the end of your book. And that's how you will satisfy your customer. They'll feel satisfied after finishing this book. But at the same time, each chapter or each comic book, it needs to build up to its own little crescendo. And after it has that crescendo, there needs to be a hook, so that your reader will say, I want to read the next chapter, or I want to read the next comic book. And that has to be something which is generated from a diversity of thought. It simply does. You can't have the same hook over and over again. It does not work. It reminds me of that old Aesop's fable. What is it? The fox and the lion, I think it is, which the moral is familiarity breeds contempt. And this is one of the things about human nature. Familiarity breeds contempt. If your audience gets too familiar with what you're doing in the pattern that you are using, even to hook them, then they're going to be too familiar with it, and it's going to breed contempt. And they're not going to be hooked anymore. So you can have a diverse number of hooks at the end of your chapter, at the end of your comic, by putting in different things. You can have a physical confrontation that's not resolved. You can have a mental confrontation that's not resolved. You can have an emotional confrontation that's not resolved. You can have a mystery. You can have people asking questions that need to be answered. You can have a number of things, and it needs to be there in order to hook your audience, in order to bring them back so that they want to keep on reading. And that's how you satisfy your audience. And the thing is that with comics, this really, really needs to be done, because you can't go on to the next chapter until, well, 30 days or however long it takes for the next comic to come out. So you really need to hook your audience. And this is missing in a lot of comics today, certainly at Marvel, because you know what the crescendo is leading up to. Actually, there is no crescendo. You know what the end point of each of these chapters is going to be. It's going to be self-affirmation for your protagonist. That's all it's going to lead up to. So you know that all of the things that come before that are just going to bend and twist everything in order to make sure that you get to that self-affirmation. And since you already know what's going to happen and you know that everything's just going to work out that way, then there is no build-up and therefore there is no crescendo. And if you don't have a crescendo, then you can't write a hook for people to actually come and buy the next book, because they're going to say to themselves, this was garbage. Why would I come back for another section of garbage? I know how you're going to write it. You're going to write it exactly the same as this one. So therefore, I'm not going to buy the next book. So you need to have a diverse number of hooks, which originate from diversity of thought. And secondly, another way that you need diversity is diversity in voices of your characters. Now, your editor will tell you that you can't have these two characters because they are too similar. Either put them into one character or give them each a unique voice. When you start a story, you are usually told that you need to sit down and fill out a sheet or a card where it has all of your attributes of each of your characters, not just your physical attributes, but your mental and emotional attributes, and this will determine their voice. And each of their voices needs to be distinct. Each of their voices needs to be unique. You need to have a diverse number of voices. But again, you're not going to get that in your comics, your Marvel comics today, or a lot of other comics as well, because everybody, you can just take their dialogue and switch it up for anyone that's in the book, and it will still have the same end product. You don't have a diversity of voices. And you can see this when you hear Son Amonat say things like, we are looking for someone with a unique voice to hire. You know what? Someone with a unique voice is no good, because that's all they know is that one unique voice. If you're a good writer, you need to be able to write a number of diverse voices. And your politically correct people would say, no, that's cultural appropriation. You can't do that. But honestly, in order to be a good writer, that's what you need. You need to be able, if you're a man, to write a good woman. If you're a woman, to write a good man. If you're someone who's white, to write people who are not white. And a whole bunch of different kinds of characters. And they each need to have a unique voice. And that's the thing. You need to have a unique voice so that you have all of these basic building blocks in order to build that suspense, in order to build that interaction, in order to lead up to that denouement, in order to lead to your hook, which will keep your reader reading. That's what you need. And the third reason, the third way I would say that you need some diversity, it feeds out of the first two. And it comes from the fact that when you get to the end of your story arc, whether that be in a number of comics or at the end of your book, again, you will want to write a new story arc. And in a book, that's, a sequel. In comics, that's just there. That's expected. There's another one coming afterwards. And again, you have to have a lot of diversity in your new story. That is to say, there is a balance that needs to be struck between what you have there previously and what you're going to write for a new story. And this is what your audience is going to look for, and this is how you draw your audience back in. And again, it's a very, very delicate balance, because you need to draw your audience back in by making sure that all of those elements are there which drew them into the first book or the first story arc, but you have something which is new, which will draw them into wanting to read this story just like they read the last one. And usually, in order to do that, you need to introduce new characters and new unique voices. And the thing is that, again, that unique voice, it has to feed into this balance where you're not ticking off the people who came back for more, but at the same time, you're not making it stale. And usually, the two ways that this happens is you can have characters, new characters come in with diverse voices, but they have to be introduced very slowly. If you have new characters that are going to propel the story forward in a new direction, if they're on the side of the protagonist, then usually they have to be brought in very, very slowly. or else you're going to tick off the people who want that little bit of familiarity. At the very least, start off with that same kind of feel as your first book, as your first story arc, and then move into another one. And it has to be organic, and it has to flow, and it has to make sure that it starts from something small and builds up and builds up. And so it's very, very painstaking and slow. But at the same time, there is one exception to this, one very big exception to this. And of course, that is the villain. You can make your villain someone who is completely different than your last villain. Actually, you should make your villain someone who is completely different with a completely different voice, and you need to have diversity in your villains. But you're, of course, not going to get that from Marvel or any of your politically correct comics. Why? Because they will not make the villain the most diverse character. They just won't. They would think that as being offensive. They want to make all of their characters as unique as possible, which is the exact opposite of what you need to do. That destroys the balance altogether of trying to feed your old audience and draw in a new audience and make sure you sell more books. Because again, you need that balance. You do need diverse voices. You do need diversity of characters. You do need to bring in new characters and new voices proceeding upon diversity of thought. And that's what your editor is going to tell you to do. And that's what needs to happen in order to draw people in order to make sure they want to fork over more money so that they can buy your story and you can continue to write. And that's what needs to happen. And that's not happening at Marvel. And it's certainly not happening in any of these new characters that they're trying to force down your throat. And why this is happening with comics, it is just baffling, because if you have a book, I mean, in order to find out what your audience wants, you have to wait. You have to wait until you get audience feedback after the first book is out. But with comics, since every chapter is a new book, you can get that feedback really quickly, and you can understand what your audience wants, and you can understand where diversity is working, where your diversity of thought is working, and where it is feeding into diverse characters and putting new people in and putting in diverse voices. You can understand that fairly quickly by listening to your audience and see what appeals to people. And this is the whole thing, because the people who run Marvel and who run the other companies, they don't care about their audience. That's just the pure and simple truth of the matter. And that's why Comicsgate exists, because we're a customer movement in order to demand better stories and a better product. Anyways, if I give you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield on the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think is the heart of a good story. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.